Okay, we are now in Chapter 4 of The Manipulated Mind by Denise Wynn, and the name of this chapter is Conditioning. And there are some quotes, of course, in the beginning. Their behavior was shaped by the use of rewards and other conditioning processes. They were led to believe that no one at home cared what happened to them. They felt out of control and learned helplessness. The unpredictability of their captors' behavior confused their expectations and assumptions. Without a norm to which they could adapt, they felt even less in control. Much has been written about the process called conditioning. Its role as a therapeutic aid, its role as a coercive agent, and the pervasive, often unrecognized part it plays in the formation of attitudes, behavior patterns, and personality traits. It can be defined quite simply as a learned association between two things which consequently affects one's actions. If a blast of air hits you in the eyes, you blink. That is a reflex action, an automatic response which takes place without your thinking about it or perhaps even being aware of it. Imagine this scenario, however. You are sitting in a doctor's surgery waiting room, right opposite the door to his room. Every time the door opens and he calls, "Next, please," the blast of air makes you blink. You have a long wait and a lot of blasts of air in the eye. When you finally leave the surgery, you go to wait for a bus, and being first in the queue, are standing right in front of the doors as they open. A blast of air hits you in the eyes, and in your head you instantly hear the words, "Next, please." You have learned, temporarily at least, to make an association between doors that open and blast you with air and the words, "Next, please." That is conditioning, at one of its many levels. The procedure known as classical conditioning developed from the work on reflex actions which Ivan Pavlov, the Russian physiologist, was carrying out in the early 1900s. He was not the first to note that reflex actions could be conditioned. In the middle of the 19th century, for instance, Claude Bernard noticed, while collecting gastric secretions from a horse for experimental purposes, that after he had been collecting the secretions for some while, he only had to enter the stable for the horse to start producing them. However, it was Pavlov who first paid the phenomenon more than passing interest, gave it a name, and proceeded to make it the subject of his investigations. His work was totally concerned with the conditioning of reflex actions, whereas his successors moved on to the application of conditioning principles to a whole range of behavior other than reflex actions. For that reason, the process which Pavlov called conditioning is usually now termed classical conditioning, to distinguish it from what came later, operant conditioning. Pavlov made his initial discovery much in the way that Bernard came upon his. He was engaged in studying digestion, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1904, and had devised a way of measuring the amounts of fluids secreted in dogs' stomachs and mouths. The juices were secreted when he gave the dogs food, which was what he expected. What he didn't expect was what happened next. During the course of his experiments, he found that the dogs started salivating before they had even seen food. In fact, as soon as Pavlov entered their room, it was clear that they had come to associate him with food, and that association was sufficient to trigger a reflex reaction to food. Pavlov set about investigating scientifically the ramifications of this causal discovery. Using a tube which carried saliva from the salivary gland through the dog's mouth into a measurement receptacle, he first measured the secretions produced when food powder was put in the dog's mouth. Then, taking care that there were no distractions such as outside noise or movements, he started striking a tuning fork just before he gave the dog food. After he carried on this practice for some time, he then tried striking the tuning fork and not providing food. The sound was sufficient to make the dog salivate almost exactly as much as when food was placed in its mouth. In the jargon of conditioning, the food was an unconditioned stimulus, and salivation to food an unconditioned response, i.e., food naturally and automatically elicits the response of salivation. The tone of the tuning fork was a conditioned stimulus, and salivation on hearing the tone alone was a conditioned response, i.e., an unnatural response that could only be learned. No dog ever previously exposed to a tuning fork would salivate at the sound of it. Only because a dog had been taught that a tuning fork signals food would the salivation response be set in motion. That was just the beginning. Experiments were then carried out to establish just how long an interval between the giving of a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus would still lead to a conditioned response when the conditioned stimulus was given alone. How long did the learned response of salivating to a tuning fork carry on occurring if, after a while, no food ever followed the hearing of the sound? Did the conditioned stimulus have to be something so blatant as the sound of a tuning fork, or could it be something considerably more subtle? It was soon discovered, for instance, that time was as sure a conditioner as sound or the sight of an object. If food was presented at very regular intervals and no tuning fork struck, the dogs learned to associate the length of time that passed with the imminent arrival of food. They would start to salivate just before it was due. That is a phenomenon familiar in everyday life. Someone who is used to having breakfast at 8, lunch at 12, tea and biscuits at 4, and dinner at 7:30 in the evening will feel hungry at those times as those times approach, because his body is conditioned to receive food on cue. Therefore, the gastric juices start churning in readiness as the right time approaches. But back to the tuning fork for a moment. Pavlov, having conditioned his dogs to salivate to the tone, wanted to know how permanent that response would be if food, which was the real reason for salivating to a tone, ceased to follow the tone ever again. He found, as might be expected, that as time went on and the dogs heard a tone but received no food shortly after, they salivated less and less to the sound of the tuning fork and finally ceased to salivate at all when they heard it. The association between tuning forks and food had been extinguished. However, occasionally, a while after the sound had ceased to produce any salivation, out of the blue, a dog would suddenly salivate on hearing it. This Pavlov called spontaneous recovery, and surmised that it meant the learned response had been suppressed rather than forgotten. But as again no food would appear, the conditioned response would once again be suppressed or even become truly forgotten. And we'll pick this up in the next video. That was the beginning of chapter 4 in the Manipulated Mind, and this is by Denise Wynn. So I'll see you there. Don't go away. Tune in.